Bonsoir à tout le monde et bienvenue. Merci d'être avec nous ce soir malgré le temps un peu pluvieux. Welcome and thank you very much for attending tonight's lecture series, which is organized by the Graduate Institute together with the European delegation, and I'm the head of the delegation of the European Union here. And this time we organized this a lecture in cooperation with the Belgium permanent representation here. We're very pleased to continue our cooperation with the Graduate Institute on this series of lectures under the title of Europe Tomorrow. Indeed, nearly a year ago, we started this cooperation with the idea to discuss all kinds of topics that are of concern to the European Union, but also beyond. Over the past year, we have heard about the EU's geopolitical role. We have heard about the EU as a humanitarian actor. We've also heard about the EU's engagement in the fight against torture and the death penalty. And you will get also soon an invitation for a next lecture by Alexander Stubb, who is the former Prime Minister of Finland. But today, I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Herman van Rompuy, who is the first full-time President of the Council of the European Union, as a keynote speaker here tonight. The title of his lecture will be The EU in a Global Storm, and it is certainly a provocative one. After all, aren't we all in a global storm? Clearly, these are challenging times, not only for the EU, but for the whole international community. It is often said that young people are the future. But sometimes we tend to forget that they are also the present. They play indeed a key role, and we have seen that very recently again in the whole program about #Fridays for Future, the movement all over the world. Without active contribution by the young people, the students, we are certainly not going to find the right answers in building a right future, in building the future of the world. So we have to involve you in the process of creating the Europe of tomorrow, of creating the world of tomorrow. And where can there be a better place than do it here today in the Maison de la Paix here in Geneva? Really, I think we are living through a global storm right now, probably. But at the same time, when working here in Geneva on issues like human rights, on issues like humanitarian affairs, on health, on labor, I'm also quite impressed to see how much resilience, how much strength, how much strong will there is amongst colleagues, amongst civil society actors, amongst the EU officials to make indeed our world a better place. And we at the European Union are ready to play our part. As the outgoing High Representative of the European Union has recently said, in these times, the world needs a reliable global power. And the European Union has been in difficult times on most of the issues, that reliable global power that is big enough and also be able to create a sort of umbrella for others to come and feel really less lonely in a difficult world of today. With these words, I would like to thank Mr. Van Rompuy to be here with us. I would like to thank also the Belgian representation for their very strong support. I would like to wish you all a very interesting and stimulating debate. And with this, I would like to call the Belgium Ambassador on the stage to introduce Mr. Van Rompuy. Thank you.
Walter, thank you very much. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Minister of State Herman van Rompuy, former Prime Minister of Belgium, former and first full-time President of the European Council, and renowned author of haikus, and whom I got to know personally in 2008 when he presided over the lower chamber of the Belgian Federal Parliament. He studied philosophy and economics at the Catholic University of Leuven, also my alma mater. After ending his studies, he joined the think tank of the National Bank of Belgium and later became chief of the think tank of the Flemish Christian Democratic Party. So he certainly is a thinker. And it is true that he carries a reputation of being an intellectual, but he is also a doer, putting theory into practice. He quickly, from 75, became an advisor to various ministers. He became president of the Flemish Christian Democratic Party from 88 until 93, when he was appointed Minister for Budget and Vice Prime Minister from 93 until 99. He was a member of the parliament, either as a member of the lower chamber or as a senator, from 88 until 2008. In these various capacities, Minister of State Van Rompuy has been one of the architects of successive Belgian constitutional reforms, and he can therefore be considered as one of the fathers of the current Belgian state structure. In 2008 and 2009, he was Prime Minister of Belgium and dealt with the acute banking and ensuing very profound economic crisis, the first dip, as it is known, before becoming, in 2010, the first full-time president of the European Council until 2014. During this double mandate, because he had been reappointed for a second mandate and for a second and last term in 2012, he helped steer the European Union through the storm of, again, the financial and economic crisis, the second dip, as we call it. I have no doubt that his background as an economist has been an invaluable asset during his tenure as President of the European Council in that period of time. Minister of State Van Rompuy is, of course, Belgian, but he is also profoundly European. He personifies a double evolution, one by which, since 1957, Belgian identity has become increasingly European, and by which Belgium has at the same time contributed to the emergence of a certain European identity. So when in November 2009 the EU needed to appoint its first full-time president of the European Council, after the Treaty of Lisbon came into force, his colleagues in the Council more or less naturally looked into his direction. So dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to end this introduction with just two quotes. The first quote comes from the Wall Street Journal in November 2009, the time when Mr. Van Rompuy had been appointed. It said that, and I quote, "Van Rompuy managed to keep a country together with 6 parliaments and a bureaucracy with more than 50 ministers. If you know how to govern Belgium, then you can certainly lead the EU," end of quote. I think they were right. President Van Rompuy certainly gave direction to the EU in those difficult years. The second quote comes from himself and casts some doubt over the first quote, or at least it invites to reflection. It says that, and I quote again, "We as politicians do assure that we have it all under control, but in reality we have never been so powerless. The simple truth is that it eludes us, that we are often just bystanders," end of quote. I like to think, Minister of State Herman Van Rompuy, that over the years you have shown this not to be entirely true. And I will now happily give you the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, thank you, Geert, for this flattering introduction. I have to be flattered once a day. You did the job today. A few years ago, I wrote a book, Europe in the Storm, by the way, that I strongly recommend. Today, we talk about the world in the storm. And these are strange times for the world, for what we called the West, for the nation states, and the European Union. What's happening? established values and institutions. Internal and international power relations are changing rapidly against a backdrop of revolutionary developments in the digital field and also with regard to the climate. Even though global prosperity continues to grow, I saw the latest figures, the world GDP will grow this year even with 3%. So even though global prosperity continues to grow, and there are hardly any wars, of course, outside the Middle East, there is still a feeling of unease everywhere. Until recently, one could say that Asia incarnated hope and the West incarnated fear. There's a quote coming from the famous book of Dominique Moisy, The Geopolitics of Emotions. So even if you can say Asia hope and West fear, that is less clear today. There is uncertainty all over the globe. In some way, we are experiencing a kind of, and that's a contradiction in terms, a globalization of nationalism. It is often about nostalgic nationalism. The late French President François Mitterrand said once, nationalism means war, and it is historically proven. I spoke about nostalgic nationalism. Fortunately, the European Union has been spared the slogan, "Make the EU great again." But Europe, like the West as a whole, is undergoing profound changes in society itself. It is also the case in authoritarian regimes where social and sometimes even political tensions, sometimes hidden political tensions, are also very high, especially if the economies are not performing well. Ladies and gentlemen, EU citizens are aware that the national framework is too narrow to protect them, and to protect is a key word, too narrow to protect them better from real or perceived threats by their leaders at every level of power. And to solve the major problems of our time, such as irregular migration, climate change, inequalities caused by inter alia major international tax fraud, terrorism, trade wars, financial instability. People want to be better protected against those threats. But the national democratic institutions are the only ones that citizens, so to speak, have control over. The reason for the reluctance to what we call more Europe are thus related to the fact that national democratic legitimacy is stronger than European legitimacy. It is therefore more difficult for citizens to transfer national sovereignty to a higher level of power, for instance the EU, where they have the impression that they do not have enough control over it. I repeat, although citizens know that this transfer of power to the EU is necessary to address precisely the reasons for their concerns and the lack of protection. In times of confusion, and I described just the confusion, in times of confusion, political leadership and the courage, political courage, are absolutely key. But it is not an easy task at a time when there are 11 minority governments in the Union, 11 out of the 27. A simple question, can Europe be strong if the member states are weak? As a result of those tensions, steps towards more European integration and cooperation will only be taken in the Union when there is no alternative, but all too often in a crisis. But according to my experience, big and difficult decisions in our personal life, in the life of nations, also in the economic life, are often made with their backs to the wall. I said a few weeks ago in Britain that the final decision about Brexit will be taken, the back against the wall, the abyss in front of them, and the knife to the throat. It was not very well welcomed. But it is true, you see this these days. I know gradualism is inevitable, but the steps must not be too small. Gradualism shouldn't be too gradual. These tensions are also reflected in populism. The vast majority of citizens in Europe do not want to leave the Union and the euro area. Populism wants to remain popular, and therefore, populists can only claim to reform the EU from the inside out, not to leave, because the people don't want to leave. They have had to review their attitude, populists, towards the European Union. Just a few words about Brexit. You allow me to say it's too sad a story. In the event of a deal approved by the British Parliament, there will be a transitional period until the end of 2020, during which the UK will remain in the customs union and in the single market. Not much will change in this period. However, that period will be longer, because negotiating a free trade agreement is a very complex process for the UK as well as for the European Union. 45% of the UK's exports of goods and services go to the EU 27. Conversely, the UK is only the destination for 8% of EU 27 exports. These negotiations will be difficult because the EU will insist on its norms and values of mutual trade and will demand a level playing field that will make any model of low-tax country impossible. The uncertainty for investors and the economy at large can therefore last for many years to come. Brexit is not the end of the story. The EU's so-called crisis has been pushed into the background by the trade wars, by Brexit, and by the rise of national populism. The European project itself is stagnating in the 27 countries, but there is no sign of dissolution, especially now that many citizens on the continent are seeing the consequences of the British debacle. The EU will lose one member, a big one, an important one. But at the same time, we are negotiating with other countries. But it is more than just a mistake not to have rewarded North Macedonia for the political courage it showed in the name change agreement with Greece. This lack of empathy will further increase the distance between the East and the West in the Union. And it has implications for the region as a whole, beyond the North Macedonian issue. Of course, the conditions for accession must be met. And the experience of recent years in some of our member states has prompted the Union to exercise greater caution. However, the prospect of new membership of the Union must be maintained. The economic future of those countries in the Western Balkans should not lie in Beijing or Moscow, but in the Union. And even for the three countries that belong to the former Soviet Union, such as Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, linked to us by an association agreement, such a link is not the last step in the cooperation with the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, what should be in the EU strategic agenda for the coming year and for the coming years? First of all, the EU must remain faithful to its principles. Life is always a combination of principles and interests, but also principles. The first area where this applies is trade. The EU has remained almost the only defender of the free and fair trade and rules-based trade. It resolutely rejects protectionism. The EU will continue to do so after Brexit. And the recent proof of this is the free trade agreement concluded with Japan, the biggest ever negotiated by the European Union. And the second example is the political agreement on a free trade agreement with the Mercosur countries, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. When this is ratified, it will be the biggest one, even bigger than the agreement we negotiated with Japan. And we have done this in the midst of rising protectionism. The EU wants to resolve the trade disputes that it has with countries such as China through dialogue, not through a tariff war, and we want to give solutions within the framework of the World Trade Organization. An important test is the EU-China investment agreement to be concluded next year. It must show that negotiations pay off. If you ask me to summarize our approach, it's very simple. It's firmness and dialogue. For the Belgians among us, it is the Herman doctrine 30 years ago. Firmness and dialogue. If the EU and the US had negotiated with China to create a level playing field for investors and for trade, we would have stood much stronger and would not have pushed the world economy into uncertainty or stagnation and recession. The Union has shown recently that it can defend its interests by taking retaliatory measures, including with regards to the United States, and by combating also dumping if necessary. The EU now has the new legal instruments to do this. They may not yet be sufficient. On the other hand, every effort must be made to ensure that the World Trade Organization continues to function as one country is trying to prevent. More than a year ago, the President of the European Commission negotiated a kind of armistice in the trade dispute with the US. Jean-Claude Juncker was able to do this because he could speak on behalf of 500 million Europeans. We spoke with one voice. But the threat of a trade war is not over yet. In 2018, the United States was the largest partner for the EU exports of goods and the second largest partner for the EU imports of goods. A trade war between those two blocs is the most dangerous of all. The EU has applied its principles in its negotiations with the UK, and that is why it hasn't deviated from its principles. The integrity of the single market and the four freedoms are essential for all 27 countries. The Union didn't sacrifice this acquis to accommodate a country wishing to leave the European Union. These principles are also reflected in the fact that the single market is safeguarded against unfair competition, including tax competition, and against dominant positions. The European Commission's actions, including with regard to the so-called GAFA companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, must be seen in this light. The Union and the Euro area must defend also, as I said, their interests in various areas in the name of European sovereignty, or, if you don't like that word, European autonomy. The EU and its member states have fallen behind competitively in the new economy, which is permeating all sectors, such as the very important car industry. Among the 15 most important digital companies in the world, there is not a single European one. Give you an example in terms of sustainable batteries, we have to become too dependent on Asia. And we are also lagging in this crucial sector of artificial intelligence. STEM study programs, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, STEM study programs in Europe must be given a boost, especially for girls. We shouldn't lose the war for talents. China and India are already home to the highest numbers of university and STEM graduates. Yes, there is a brain drain. In one neighboring country, neighboring to Belgium, for example, fewer young people can graduate in artificial intelligence because there is a shortage of professors. The only way to restore our sovereignty is cooperation between the member states. The scale has become essential in global competition. Size matters, and our British friends are not fully aware of it. We offer the largest single market in the world, but others are making increasing use of it. I would also refer in passing to the acquisitions of own European companies by non-Europeans, especially in strategically important sectors. The EU and the member states finally have instruments to prevent this from happening easily. Protect without falling into the trap of protectionism. That's the big challenge. Protect without falling into the trap of protectionism. And France and Germany have understood this and are now working better together, at least in this field. And by the way, the draft EU budget focuses on research and innovation as a top priority. It's about competitiveness. You can't have European sovereignty without a strong European competitive position. In the military field, we need to move towards much greater sovereignty, especially at a time of growing American isolationism and greater Russian assertiveness. Here too, things are getting better when I look at an initiative such as the so-called PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, with the participation of 27 member states, and when I look at the European Intervention Force. Because the ultimate goal must be a European army. Dreams are not forbidden. Only then will the Union be a real global power. Otherwise, it will be a global player, albeit in crucial areas such as trade and climate. In the field of energy too, we must get rid of the overdependence on oil and gas on one supplier, namely Russia. Here too, progress has been made in recent years, as well as in creating the free flow of energy throughout the Union. Achieving the ambitious climate targets for 2030, minus 40% greenhouse gas emissions, and 2050, net zero emissions, will contribute greatly to regaining this energy sovereignty. That will take efforts. I add that we were able to meet our emission targets for 2020, minus 20% compared to 1990. By the way, this minus 20% compared to 1990, if you have a look at the GDP growth, that's more than plus 50%. So this shows the decoupling of greenhouse gas emissions and economic growth. I want Europe to become the first climate-neutral continent in the world, Madame von der Leyen said just after she became President of the European Commission. People realize that our current way of life is untenable, but changing it is difficult. Whoever sees the good doesn't do it. You find this quote in the Bible, and you find it also by a famous Roman poet, Ovidius. Those who like Latin, video meliora deterioraque sequor. I do the opposite of what I think is being the good. Americans' control of dollar transactions and the US subsidiaries of foreign businesses gives it significant power. America's use of the dollar clearing system to enforce sanctions on states has encouraged some countries to reduce their dependence on the dollar. The euro makes the EU more autonomous. The euro is the currency of 340 million people and the second one most used in the world, with a share of 36% of global payments. Protecting the Union's external borders is also a matter of sovereignty. As a union, we must be able to decide for ourselves who enters our territory and who does not. The more secure the borders are, the less solidarity we need to call for in the distribution of asylum seekers across the Union as a whole. It's much easier to reach a consensus among the member states on the former than on the latter. By the way, solidarity in all areas becomes difficult in the Union. And solidarity on migration divides the Union deeply between the East and the West, the North and the South. But it also divides the US and the UK. Significant progress has been made on border control since 2016. However, we must be aware that we need the Mediterranean riparian countries in order to achieve this goal. The Schengen area has survived the crisis of 2015-2016. However, the fourfold increase in the population of Africa by the end of this century will require further strengthening of our external borders on top of other policies supporting growth for all in Africa. Africa is our neighbor. Africa has now 1 billion inhabitants. It will have in 2050 more than 2 billion. And by the end of this century, if the current trends are still in place, it will be 4 billion, as much as Asia, India, and China included. Migration policy cannot do without humanity either. Our degree of civilization is measured by what we do for the most vulnerable. And there is a looming humanitarian catastrophe this winter. The number of asylum seekers arriving in Greece increased by 23% compared to 2018. And I do not include the consequences of Turkish military invasion of northern Syria. We must also be aware that legal migration is inevitable. I give you just evidence for that. Eurostat, our statistical office, recently showed that by the end of this century, the Italian population will have halved without migration. Halved. We need popular support for legal migration. But as long as irregular migration is not under control, we will have problems promoting legal migration. Immigration is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as a threat throughout the Union. But emigration and the resulting aging of the labor force at home is a real threat, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. It also includes brain drain and means the loss of future growth drivers. Ladies and gentlemen, in addition to sovereignty, cohesion is a major objective of the Union. Cohesion is not only about income distribution, but also about the relationship between cultures, religions, and ethnic groups. But there are also interfaces between the two. The cohesion of European societies will be a major concern in the coming years. The convergence in income levels between the member states is impressive, albeit that since the multiple crises, starting in 2008, that movement has been interrupted. But a new structural problem arises. Economic activity, especially one that is knowledge and innovation intensive, tends to spatially cluster in areas that are already more advanced. Productivity, innovation, skills and driving firms will increasingly concentrate in a few wealthy areas, while the less prosperous are excluded from the gains. So, the current debate on the EU industrial policy overlooks this issue of inequality. This phenomenon, or the accumulation of wealth in certain regions, has already been known in post-war history. For this reason, a regional policy was adopted to counteract the effects of market forces. But this new concentration of prosperity favors cities over rural areas. The gap between the two is in danger of widening. Frustrations are already mounting in the countryside. Look at France. I would like to elaborate on this theme of the convergences of divergences of incomes in each of our member states. Unemployment, also as a result of digitalization. Unemployment, the backwardness of many people with a migration background. The gap between the highly skilled and those with lower qualifications. All this can increase inequalities, which in turn are the source of populist successes. Precarious jobs create also uncertainty. One can therefore have full employment and social malaise at the same time. And these inequalities explain a lot about what happened in the UK and the US. By the way, inequalities are much higher and are widening in the Anglo-Saxon world more than in the EU. But social inequalities are on the rise also in EU countries. The proportion of employed persons at risk of poverty has risen from 8% in 2010 to 9% in 2017, meaning that today nearly 1 in 10 employed people over the age of 18 in Europe are at risk of poverty after social transfers. These income inequalities are sometimes less a matter of absolute level than of relative positions. In the EU, more related to wealth than to income. Unhappiness comes from comparison with others. On the other hand, the accumulation of wealth among some is causing frustration in Europe. An unwanted consequence of low interest rates is that it deprives pensioners of a supplement to their pension. And the high rise in share prices resulting from these low interest rates increases the inequalities in wealth. My next short chapter, it's possible that we have to achieve all these objectives about sovereignty and cohesion, that we have to achieve these objectives in a climate of economic stagnation or recession, at least in some advanced countries. This all needs to be seen in perspective. Most major economies are continuing to grow. Even in the euro area, GDP growth will be around 1% in the coming years. But we have to remain concerned, and I explain. The yield of the 10-year US Treasury bonds has been below the yield of the 3-month Treasury bill since May of this year. Every recession of the post-war era was preceded by an inversion of the yield spread. That keeps me concerned. The very slow or even stagnation in 2019 of the strongest economy in the Eurozone is very significant, even if Germany has the most cyclical economy because it is the most industrialized, twice as industrialized as the UK, and because it is the most export-led. The current problems in the global economy are mainly man-made or homegrown. Trade war, Brexit. But at the same time, the economic problems are also the result of not enough European integration and cooperation. In a way, this is also man-made. Our economies could be structurally much stronger if we were to cooperate more in the EU on industrial policy. The threat of stagnation or recession must be a stimulus to work on the problems of European competitiveness. A question, rhetorical question. In such a recessive climate, should we launch a new round of fiscal austerity due to the fact that a number of countries will not respect the 3% deficit rule in case of a recession or a stagnation? The ECB calls for more fiscal stimulus, especially in those countries that can afford it. And in this way, expansionary monetary policy with the lowest interest rates for centuries. In this way, expansionary monetary and fiscal policy would work in the same direction. But it must be a fiscal stimulus through investment, and investment in those sectors which are high on the societal agenda, such as climate change, mobility, renewable energy, education. Initiatives were taken by at the EU level, the famous Juncker Plan for strategic investments, good for 500 billion investments, mainly in the private sector. And also initiatives taken at the national level, in the Netherlands and Germany. But more is needed. And we should also be aware that in the EU we also suffer from underinvestment in the private and the public sector for budgetary reasons in the public sector, while in China, for example, there is overinvestment. And this gap between savings and investment, between supply and demand in the EU explains partially the negative interest rates. But the question with economic growth is the following. Who benefits from it? In the case of budgetary consolidation or climate change policies, the question is also, who pays? The issue of the distribution of costs and benefits is once again crucial. Populism is increasingly being driven by social elements. Many populist parties are on the right on the socio-cultural level, but on the left on a socio-economic level. We shouldn't forget that. A possible recession will also have an impact on the Eurozone. Divergences among member states will increase, and therefore it's unfortunate that the banking union is not yet fully completed, despite the improvements agreed in recent months. The Eurozone and most banks have become more solid. Greece is now also benefiting from the short-term negative interest rates, can you imagine? And from a rate of barely 1.5% over 10 years. But the euro area as a whole is not yet solid enough in view of a possible subsequent financial crisis, due to a particularly high level of global private and public debt. That level is higher than 10 years ago when the financial crisis broke out. So we need a genuine economic and monetary union, and we need a stronger Franco-German initiative in this area. My final remarks. The European countries are forced to revise their model based on the social market economy. We already had a strong social correction with the creation of the welfare state. A pressing question: how can Europe's social model survive with a rapidly aging population and as the rise in non-standard work, going from flex jobs to self-employed, part-time jobs and so on? So the rise of non-standard work can erode public revenues in the longer term. 40% of the European workforce is today engaged in non-standard forms of work. Yet labor taxes, personal income tax and social security contributions are a large source of government revenue for the most advanced economies and are the foundation of Europe's social model. Today, an average of 41% of the EU's 28 government revenues are spent on social protection. Addressing this gap between revenues and expenditures will also require recalibrating taxation systems in order to shift the burden away from labor to new forms of taxation and to ensure fair corporate tax systems. You have the social correction, you have also the ecological correction. It's also needed, and the climate problem is also man-made. And the same goes for the solutions. Technology alone will not solve the problem. Policies will make the difference. The political agenda is shifting in many advanced economies. But climate objectives require more than a correction. They need a transformation in all sectors of the economy. No one escapes. It's a matter of survival, an existential problem, life or death, as some say. Even the implementation of the Paris Agreements, December 2015, will be far from sufficient to achieve the objective of staying below the 2 degrees Celsius increase. Nevertheless, let us be realistic. Implementation of the current plans is now the biggest priority. I am less interested in bidding on an ever more ambitious target. But the question, who pays the taxes and who will finance the investments, will be the central political question. On an international level, choices have to be made. It remains strange that it is the US that is questioning the multilateral framework. But other global actors, too, often pay only lip service to this framework. Saving multilateralism is one of the main priorities for the coming years. It's a choice between order or chaos. I continue to hope that the overriding interest that will eventually coincide with self-interest will prevail. Ladies and gentlemen, people may not be happy with the Union, but they are increasingly happy in the Union. Leaving is not the wish of the overwhelming majority of the citizens of the EU 27. Support for EU membership is now at its highest for 27 years, for a generation. In a quiet environment with nice neighbors, the European project could have been watered down. But we are surrounded by global actors who use import tariffs, data, and refugees as weapons against us. This external pressure will mean that Europe will have to reinvent itself once more, this time as a geopolitical power. And finally, there are many reasons to be skeptical, to be insecure, or anxious. But pessimism is a form of intellectual laziness. I explain myself. A pessimist is always right. Either his prophecy turns out badly and he says, happily so, or the pessimist is right, and when he is right, his reaction is, I told you so. Happily so, I told you so. So he's always right. Better to remain a man or a woman of hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for outlining this storm to us and also actually providing some remedies of how to be able to face this kind of storm. So I'd like to address you with a few questions before opening up to the audience, if I may. And these questions are about how to navigate the storm, right? Because you showed like the storm has many different triggers, the US, trade wars, China, Brexit, social inequalities, migration pressure. So there's many things that actually influence this kind of storm. But we could argue to navigate a storm, we need a captain or a team of captains, a map, instruments, and also a robust vehicle. I've been in a few airplanes that didn't seem so robust when we were in a storm. in the hope that the storm is not a deadly storm. So if I may, my first question would be about the captain or the captains that are needed to actually navigate in this storm. And it seems to me that the captains that are steering the European Union are not always of one opinion. I mean, just briefly, we can look at, there's a sanction regime against Russia, but at the same time, different member states take different positions towards Russia. Or when it comes to climate, as you mentioned, there is a policy that the EU is pushing, but certain EU member states are much more ambitious, and other EU member states, some of them have a coal industry, want to protect this coal industry, and hence are actually blocking more ambitious policy domains. So View once said, even if our unity remains our strength, our diversity remains our wealth. And I completely see how this is super important in a time of good weather. But actually, what does diversity mean in a storm? I mean, what's the benefit of diversity in a storm? How do we negotiate diversity in a storm? Do we eventually have to move to more qualified majority voting? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
So, when you are a club with 28, there are always members of the club who are more enthusiastic, less enthusiastic, skeptical. Some are against it, some are in favor. That's the price to pay. But only the result counts. We overcame two major crises, the Eurozone crisis and afterwards the crisis of the Schengen area, the refugee crisis. I'm more familiar with the Eurozone crisis. In the Anglo-Saxon press, around the midst of 2012, the discussion was not about the collapse of the Eurozone, that was for sure. The only discussion was about when, before Christmas 2012 or after Christmas 2012. We will celebrate Christmas 2019. And the euro is a stable currency, the second currency in the world. Does that mean that there are no problems? Of course, there are always problems. But compared to the problems we had, it's almost nothing. So the result counts. And history tends only to memorize the results. And that we have to keep in mind. And the same happened in the refugee crisis, going in many directions. But we stemmed the inflow of people coming from outside Europe. We showed our solidarity, our generosity, but our population was ready to welcome 1 million, but could not live with the prospect of welcoming 3-4 million people. And therefore the European Council took action, negotiated with Turkey an agreement that until recently was still functioning. And even now, nothing to compare with what happened before the summer of 2015. So again, it's only the result that counts. My second remark is, in some of the countries of the West, they have one president and one parliament. Is the situation much better than we have in the European Union? So, the famous question of Kissinger, if I want to have the European Union on the phone, who do I have to call? If you call Washington, the problem is not who you have to call, but when, because the day after it could be totally different. So let's look at the rest also of the world and not only focusing on our own problems. And again, a club of 28 is very difficult to maneuver. But when you look at what we realized from the beginning of the Union, the beginning of the 50s, and now, it's just amazing. We have now 27, because Britain has not yet left, 28 member states. We have a common currency. We have the biggest single market in the world. We are representing 500 million people, of course, and I mentioned all the problems and the challenges we have. But compared to what we realized, and it was also with ups and with downs, can you give many examples of the history of the European institutions, even from the empty chair of de Gaulle or after the speech of Madame Thatcher in Bruges, and so on and so on. But again, only the result counts. The way to get that result, that's always a difficult one. And if you need one captain, yeah, not one captain, because we will be much more specific than any other entity, because we are not a country. I cannot speak about the European Union as a country. So it will always be very specific, and there will never be one guy or one woman who makes the ultimate decision. But you need a strong political will. And if we overcame the Eurozone crisis, it was because we were with the back against the wall. That helps always. Circumstances help. But also because there was among those leaders, members of the euro area and even beyond the euro area, the will to overcome it and not to bring down all what we built upon during decades. And that's why we overcame the crisis. There was one captain? Some are more important than others, some are more equal than others, of course. But it is a joint political will. You know that we have to take our decisions, as you said, by unanimity. And not always easy. But on the other hand, when you are vetoing, you take a big responsibility. So you think twice before that you veto a decision. We can get this level of unanimity, and sometimes we voted, for instance, on the relocation of refugees. We voted in the Council of the Justice and Home Affairs Ministers I think in September 2015. It was a qualified majority. Did it solve the problem? So unanimity is not always a disadvantage. You have to work until you get there. And most of our decisions are taken unanimously. Of course, you need a fallback position. If nothing is possible, then we have to vote. But vote is always the ultima ratio.
Thank you very much. So if I may turn a bit to the maps and the instruments that we need in a storm. Josep Borrell, in his hearing at the European Parliament, recently said that the EU has to learn the language of power. But I would actually say arguably it has been learning the language of power. And in one of these documents where it's presenting an understanding of power, maybe ambiguously so, is the global security strategy that it has presented in 2016. And for example, in the strategy, the EU argues that it's pushing for more strategic autonomy. At the same time, it actually says that it wants to deepen its relationship to NATO, i.e. also the US in terms of security matters. So one question for me would be how to reconcile these kind of goals that don't necessarily have to go in the same direction. And given that you also mentioned PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, I'm also curious whether you actually see this as a way for the European Union to push for more strategic autonomy, or whether it's actually a collection, and excuse me for this kind of term, but a collection of national pet projects where every country has put actually their preferred investment, but has not thought strategically for the EU as a whole.
Mm-hmm. To learn the language of power used to be a time that we know it very well. The UK was a world power, France was a world power, Germany was a world power. The EU changed dramatically that kind of behavior and that kind of image. So we have to learn again what we forgot, and happily so that we forgot. There's a paradox, but that is the case. In order to be relevant on the world stage, the first condition is to be united. That's the first condition. On issues which matters for the world community as a whole. I mentioned trade and I mentioned climate. We spoke with one voice in Paris. Does that mean that we are all on the same page? That in some countries they were reluctantly agreeing with the common position? No, of course, for the reasons I just explained. On trade, it was very striking that when Jean-Claude Juncker negotiated the ceasefire with President Trump, he could speak on behalf of the 28. It's not the German Chancellor. It was not the French President. It was the good old Jean-Claude Juncker who could speak on behalf of the European Union, because he was the President of the Commission, and the Commission is competent in when trade is concerned. So we managed to speak with one voice, and that is the precondition for having any influence at all. That's not speaking with one voice, but delivering the same message. For me, it's a better word than speaking with one voice. And of course, you can say, but not everybody was fully enthusiastic. That's not my problem. That's not my problem. You know, enthusiasm is not an obligation. It's not an obligation. It's only the result that finally tests. It counts. It could be that I'm too pragmatic, but I think this for steering or help to steer the European Union is the only way to do so. So, of course, in security matters, we have to do more. And there, President Obama and President Trump, they were right in saying that we are not spending enough. We have to spend more, and we have to spend better. When I look at how many tanks we have, how many aircrafts we have compared to the United States and China, that it's very, very obvious that we have to work much more together. PESCO is one step in the right direction. That was unthinkable when I was in office. When I was in office, I organized a European Council on European Defense. It was mostly about industrial policy, but it was the way to bring things further. Compared to the PESCO initiatives, is a major step. But even at that time, I still recall that I received a call from Prime Minister Cameron. He said, "What are you doing, Van Rompuy?" Because in the tabloid press it was Barroso, Commander-in-Chief of the European Army. So I was very jealous because it was not Van Rompuy, Commander-in-Chief, it was Barroso. But just to show how sensitive it was, because in the text there was, of course, nothing at all on all this. Nothing at all on all this. And by the way, we got unanimity on the conclusions of the European Council without any further difficulties. I just add here and there the word NATO, and that's what was enough. But compared to what is decided now, it's a major step, but of course we are far away from the ultimate goal. We want to remain, of course, in NATO, but the strengthening of what we call the European pillar of NATO is one of our main objectives. But again, the European Union is making progress in an atmosphere of crisis, of one we are pushed to, when there is external pressure. But the European Union is not the only institution that works in that way.
So as my last question before I turn to the audience, I'm curious how you actually would describe the vehicle that the European Union is. I mean, it has been described by observers as an empire, and there's this one term, the unimperial empire, for example, or the neoliberal empire or empire by invitation. Others, again, emphasize more fortress Europe or emphasize the economic union. Then again, other observers call it a union of values. And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more of, given your experience on the national level and on the EU level, how you actually would describe the structure, the project, the dynamic elements of the European Union that you have experienced.
Mm-hmm. An empire with a budget that is as big as 1% of European GDP, I don't think it is an empire. So let us look at things in proportion. It always helps. It always helps. Not being too modest, but not being over-ambitious at the same time. The European Union and I said it, is something very, very specific. Of course, it started as a peace project. It was an anchor for democracies, for many countries, and it is a way to have a bigger, a higher prosperity. Poland and Ukraine, by the way, they had the same level of GDP per capita in 1990. Poland is now 4 times more prosperous than Ukraine. What is the reason? There's only one reason. Poland belongs to the European Union. So prosperity, democracy, and peace, there remains big objectives. Even peace. When there was peace on the island of Ireland, it had to do with the simple fact that the UK and the Republic of Ireland were both members of the European Union. They never could have agreed on those Good Friday agreements without the context of the European Union. And you see, when one is now leaving the Union, peace is at risk. Violence can come back. So the peace project of Europe is much more relevant than most people think. You have always to think of a world of a Europe without the European Union. What is the cost of non-Europe, not only in terms of material goods and services, but also in terms of what I said, non-material. And peace is, of course, the most non-material good you can produce. So the European Union is a combination, as always, of ideas, ideals, and interests. You need both of them. It's always a combination of positive energy, the will to go forward, and negative arguments. And Brexit is for many countries now a negative argument. We want to stay in the European Union, but because we don't want to have this messy situation that we have now seen, or that we have seen in Britain the last 3 years. It's a mix of all kinds of arguments. Personally, it was the big idea of my public life. I started speaking about Europe when I was 16 years old. I'm 72 now, I'm still speaking about Europe.
Thank you for doing so. So I would like to open up to the audience. If you could very briefly introduce yourself before asking your question, I would appreciate it. Could we start up there? And I will need my glasses for this.
Thank you very much. My name is Zhang Tianze. I'm from Swiss Chinese Law Association. So my question is very simple, and is how do you think of Chinese Belt and Road Initiative? Do you think it's good or bad? And the second quick question is about the Brexit. Maybe I missed a little bit part, but I want to know, how do you think the rights of or what is the substantial rights of the European citizens might lose or gain after the Brexit? Thank you very much.
I will collect one more question just to give room to many questions, please.
Thanks very much. My name is Tom Miles. I'm a former journalist, currently no affiliation. I'm up here. I want to ask about Brexit as well, please. Specifically about the relationship with the Remainer movement in Britain. I wonder, to what extent you think the European Union has now washed its hands of the Remain movement. I mean, a week ago, Boris Johnson was, colossally unpopular, disaster, never won a vote, had a massive deficit in Parliament. And Remainers were very confident. And suddenly, there's a deal with the European Union. He's there at the summit, backslapping and high-fiving with all the heads of state. And, he's the popular guy, and he's the big Mr. Success. So, these millions of Remainers who turned out on Saturday at this march in London, I think, feel very cut off by the European Union. Is there any way back? Are there any contacts there? Is that a realistic description of the situation? Thanks very much.
On China and the Belt and Road, you put your question in this way. Is it bad or bad or good? It depends of whom. Depends of whom. I guess that you are asking me, is it good or bad for the European Union? If that is the question, we cooperate in a lot of our member states. We cooperate in the framework of the Belt and Road initiative. Some with more enthusiasm again than others, some putting more conditions than others. From the side of the European Union as such, we are asking much more what we call transparency in the process and maintaining a level playing field when our companies and other companies, Chinese companies, are participating in concrete initiatives in the Belt and Road. And we have to, this is not always the case, I put it very, very mildly. So it depends on in what kind of conditions the Belt and Road initiative is developed inside the European Union. In general, there is a rising awareness in Europe that, of course, we have to deal, and we are trading with China a lot, but there's a rising awareness that we have to do that respecting a level playing field and respecting also the wish of the Europeans to keep our strategic sectors in our own hand. And having that in mind, we are negotiating, for instance, with China now, as I said also in my speech, an investment agreement. The proof of the pudding is always in the eating. The last EU-China summit was a very good one. And you can read the conclusions. You find a lot of our concerns reflected in those conclusions. But again, we have now to see it also in concrete deeds. And we want to negotiate. We want not a trade war with China. We want to negotiate, but people have to look at the results of this dialogue, of these negotiations. And so this investment agreement is a test case. It's a test case that our method, firmness and dialogue, our method is producing results. So I'm encouraged by the latest EU-China summit conclusions, but it's not the first time that we have good conclusions. Those are the best ones, but now deeds have to follow. On Brexit, the UK is much more depending on the EU than the EU 27 is depending on the UK. We are with 440 million and the UK with 60 or 65 million. So that is not so surprising. That also was discovered, this reality was discovered by our British negotiators during those 3 years, that they had less leverage than they thought initially. They also made another mistake, but we have now an agreement, so we forget all this. But another mistake was that they thought that the European Union would negotiate not as a bloc, but that they could make a deal with Berlin, with Paris and the others, with the so-called big guys. And the reality was totally different. We were, from day one after the referendum, united. Our British friends were surprised. Actually, we surprised ourselves. And this unity, we kept them until the last minute. And so we concluded a first agreement with the May government and then an agreement with the Johnson government. You cannot say that we were not open. There is this, the European Union, by the way, is an incarnated compromise. So why should we all of a sudden not be ready to compromise if we compromise on every topic inside the Union and outside the Union? Negotiating is our DNA, so to speak. And the European Union is one long-lasting diplomatic movement. But of course, the final decision has to be taken by the UK itself. We cannot help. We cannot help. And if we help, it's counterproductive. It's counterproductive. That's also part of my answer. We were, by our British friends, strongly advised not to interfere in British politics, because it could have the opposite result. Jean-Claude Juncker is now saying, I was too cautious. Okay. But the final decision has to be taken by the British Parliament or one day or another by the British people. From a historical point of view, I am more optimistic than many others. But what I'm saying now is totally irrelevant and more a wish than something else. But I'm convinced that in not a couple of years, that's too soon, but in 10, 20 years' time, the younger generation will say, my God, what are we doing? We have to respect for most of our trade, if they are interested in trade, or most of our trade, the European standards, the European norms. We are working closely together with them on so many issues, but we have no say in it, no say in it. And Britain in the world is 60 million out of the 7 billion. So I am not desperate that one day this young generation will say, we were betrayed by our fathers and grandfathers. I'm a father and a grandfather. Normally you work for the future of them. And their future to some extent is taken away. So why not rejoining the club of the European nations? I'm not desperate. I share this feeling with President Tusk, who has the gift of being much more sharp and much more outspoken than I am. I'm the embodiment of this diplomatic movement all the time. But I'm not desperate. This is an episode in history, and if it happens, but it's not for once and for all. Nothing in life is irreversible. Nothing in life is irreversible. Not even Brexit.
Hello, I'm a student here at the Graduate Institute. Thank you, Mr. President, for your conference. You've been going through some of the domestic issues that the European Union is going through right now beyond the international dimension. One of the problems being, of course, the rise of homogeneous and reactionary forms of nationalism jeopardizing the European Union. Now, one of those arguably finds itself right now in Catalonia with the protests going on with the Spanish government. Given that I think you made some comments this year saying that it would be unthinkable for Catalonia to be part of the European Union, could you please explain to the audience why the Catalan nationalist movement is incompatible right now with the EU, and what specific features of the Catalan nationalist movement and similar movements across Europe go against the soul of the liberal democratic structures of the European Union? Thank you.
From your remarks, I retain one small, very pertinent statement, and that is finding a balance between ideals and interests. And in a very particular case, I would like to have your opinion on earlier this year, there was a decision by the competition commissioner not to allow a rapprochement between Siemens and Alstom. It hit very, very badly my feeling of integration. What do you think about that?
Is it on? Yeah. One last question, because I promised that we're going to end around 7:30, because there's also a cocktail waiting for us in the first pétale. So please.
More important than me.
A cocktail with you.
So, Mr. Van Rompuy, I'm Albert Barsegian. I'm a former graduate from College of Europe, where you have recently appointed as a chairman of the board. And during my promotion, Promotion Chopin, we were all the time discussing whether European Union has a problem with democratic deficit or not. And the recent issues, I think, for the ongoing promotion are very, very important, whether we were all the time exploring possibility of Spitzenkandidat, and at the end of the day, under the closed doors, Madame von der Leyen was selected, not elected, to be the head of the European Commission. What would you say on this? Do we have a problem on democratic deficit in the European Union or not? And you were representing European citizens or European member states while being the president of European Council. Thank you.
On Catalonia, I will give you the answer that I gave in 2012 when I was in Madrid. And the position on principle is exactly the same as 7 years ago. If Catalonia became independent, the main problem for the European Union is this independence acquired according to the constitutional process. And that makes a lot of difference. Makes a lot of difference. If not, of course, and I said it also in Madrid, it's almost unthinkable for the European Union to recognize that kind of situation. The Scottish referendum of 4 years ago was completely different. Scottish referendum got the support as a referendum, as a procedure, from Westminster. It was completely legal and constitutional, as far as, Britain has not a written constitution, but according to the constitutional habits. This was not the case and is still not the case when we speak about Catalonia. So this, and I know that it's in Barcelona and in the surroundings, that is ignored, or they pretend to ignore all this. So it is presented as if the region is independent, the day after they can become a member of the European Union. It's not the case. It's not the case. And if our Scottish friends, they have now promised a new referendum, but if they have not the backing of London, of Westminster, they will face the same problem. And I said it also in one of my rare interviews about the UK, and rare because for the reasons we mentioned, that better not to interfere in their business. But as a Belgian, we know a lot about confederalism, federalism, separatism, so could be that my opinion matters a little bit. About Siemens and Alstom, I don't know the file, but what I noticed is that on industrial policy, on this case, on the revision of competition law, there was a common position from France and Germany, which we haven't seen in the last years. As you know, that the word industrial policy was a forbidden word for long in Germany, and that the idea of European champions was not liked at all for some time, and all of a sudden they had a joint position. So I cannot challenge Madame Vestager when she said no to this merger. But what I saw was that France, Germany, and others, they are feeling the need to have much more a European approach in economic policy and in industrial policy. And in accordance to their assessment is this was an instrument to get or to have more of a stronger European position in this field of telecom and other sectors where the two companies were much more active. And they are looking at the global picture and not only the European picture. I read the arguments of the European Commission. If you want my final assessment, that it was, and I rarely use those words, more a bureaucratic decision than a political decision. And politics is not always right, and bureaucracy sometimes is right. But with the dynamics of the world economy and this rising awareness that we have to face a Chinese and American challenge, I think that another decision would have much more in that line than the decision that is taken. So for me, I think that the competition commissioner and the administration that is backing her took the decision in good faith and according to the rules as they are. My simple answer is yes, but now we live in another world. In another world. And the world changed dramatically in a few years' time. So don't be surprised if the competition legislation is revised in the upcoming years. Even the new President of the European Commission, Ms. von der Leyen, is suggesting this in the statements she made in the European Parliament. You see that I'm still moving as a diplomat. Democratic deficit. I don't know what this exactly means. So for me, it's you have not to explain it. It's not a question, but it is a very ambiguous concept because we have even a double legitimacy in the European Union. You have the legitimacy based on the nation states, because the members of the European Council, the steering body of the European Union, are of course all elected. All elected. One of the strange things is that our British friends are reproaching the European Union that they are ruled by non-elected bureaucrats. But the current Prime Minister never got the confidence of the Parliament. He's not a bureaucrat, but at least he's not elected. But not elected by his Parliament. But all the leaders of the Union are all elected. Strong national democratic base. The other hand, the European Parliament is directly elected since 1979 and is now a full parliament, competent on all the issues of the European Union. Before the Lisbon Treaty, there were areas where they had no say at all. So they appoint the President of the European Commission by secret ballot. If in some countries you have to get the consent of the Parliament by secret ballot, as a Prime Minister, you would have surprises. An understatement. So the European Commission President is elected by secret ballot, and of course the Commission as a whole needs the consent of the Parliament, and even each commissioner is scrutinized. Again here, if in every member state a future minister had to appear in front of the parliament and explain what his intentions are after 1 month, not in office, but 1 month after having been nominated, you could have a lot of surprises. All this is happening at the European level. So you have a European legitimacy, you have a national legitimacy. You have even an over-democratic process. As I read it, I have written this in this book, Europe in the Storm. You are pointing out one element of it, that is the procedure of the lead candidates. I was never enthusiastic about this, but again, you happen to be enthusiastic, I respected it. So I proposed, and with conviction, because I know him very well, Jean-Claude Juncker as president of the European Commission, and because in the European Parliament he had the strongest support. So for me, respecting the result was not a problem. About the procedure, you can have second thoughts. And you shouldn't create the illusion that when the political parties appoint a lead candidate, a Spitzencandidate, that then the European voters are taking this into account. In my country, they vote for my party, for another party. It has nothing to do with Madame von der Leyen, or 5 years ago with Jean-Claude Juncker. They are following a national debate or a national dynamics. So we create the illusion that there is some kind of almost direct election of the President of the European Commission. Not at all. Not at all. Could be there are advantages of the system, but I was never convinced. So non-respecting a procedure that in some way is for me and for many others is not a royal democratic way to have a good candidate for the European Commission. So not respecting that procedure is not that harmful at all. Because at the end of the day, Madame von der Leyen is elected by the European Parliament, directly elected by the people, directly elected by the people. So the European leaders have not respected the Spitzenkandidat procedure, but of course, everybody respects the European treaties in which is foreseen that the President of the Commission needs the approval of the Parliament by a secret vote. So there is no democratic deficit, formally, and for me, not even informally. Do you represent the citizens or the member states? The President of the European Council had a very specific task, is to chair the meetings of the European Council, and the European Council has a very specific task to give orientation to European policies and give an impulse to the European project. Of course, the beneficiaries should be the citizens. But the President of the European Council cannot work with 500 million people. He has to work with the 28 in the room and keep that club together so that we can move forward. That is his role, no other ones, no other ones. He is not the symbol of Europe. He is the chair of the most important meeting in the European Union, most important institution of the European Union. I once said, the President of the European Council is not important, but he chairs the most important institution in the Union. And that's more just than a way of speaking. And the ultimate beneficiaries are the European citizens. We are all working for the common good of the citizens. But in the intermediate steps, you have to let the system function. And if they cannot perform, if they cannot deliver the European institutions, the biggest victims are the citizens themselves. So they are not in the room, but they are always in our mind. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Van Rompuy for this presentation.